Hello, I'm your host, Crystal Wilson, and thank you for joining me as we seek to discuss a little bit about the Tobago House of Assembly. A few weeks ago, on January 25th, an election was held in Tobago, and to assist us with understanding how governance in Tobago works and some of the things we can expect to happen over the next few weeks or months, Professor Hamid Ghany is here to help us appreciate what has been taking place. Professor, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
And of course, we'll waste no time. We're going to dive straight into it, and hopefully you can start us off with helping us understand how the THA and governance in Tobago works.
Well, basically, in 1980, a Tobago House of Assembly was created by Act number 37 of 1980. And that act basically got rid of the old Tobago County Council and put in its place a Tobago House of Assembly. Under the County Council, the last County Council election in Tobago was held in 1977. There were 11 County Council seats. In 1980, when the Tobago House of Assembly Act number 37 of 1980 came into effect, it provided for 12 electoral districts. 12 electoral districts have remained in Tobago ever since. And in Acts number 39 and 40 of 1996, a change was made whereby the Tobago House of Assembly was inserted into the Constitution. So Chapter 11 became Chapter 11A that prescribes for a Tobago House of Assembly. And then Act number 40 of 1996 made arrangements for the new Tobago House of Assembly, keeping the 12 electoral districts. Now, at the time when this was passed, in November, December of 1996, a Tobago House of Assembly election was due on the 9th of December 1996. They finished all of the legislative procedures by Friday, the 6th of December 1996, and enacted into law a new Tobago House of Assembly. So when the election was held on the 9th of December 1996, the new assembly was in place, but keeping the same 12 electoral districts. So the number 12 comes from the first Tobago House of Assembly Act number 37 of 1980. It was kept in 1996, and fast forward to today, it is still at 12, but now there is discussion about changing this from 12 to 15. So that is the debate right now.
So let's go back just a bit. Can you share with me some of the political parties that would have been involved previous to this administration? And have you ever seen anything like this before concerning THA elections?
No, we haven't had it in THA elections, but the emergence of the Democratic Action Congress, the DAC, in 1977 and in 1976. In 1976, they won the 2 seats in the House of Representatives from Tobago, Mr. A.N.R. Robinson and Dr. Winston Murray. They had those 2 seats. Then that was 1976. In 1977, the PNM won the county council election 7-4. So it was PNM and DAC. Then in 1980, when they set up the Tobago House of Assembly, the DAC won the House of Assembly election 8-4. And they continually and repeatedly won those elections during the time that Mr. Robinson was the leader. Then in 1986, the NAR was created. So in after 1986, then it became the NAR that was contesting in Tobago. The DSC was no longer the party that was contesting, so that the NAR was the brand that was used. But really all of this revolved around Mr. Robinson. With the departure of Mr. Robinson from active politics by becoming the president of the country in 1997, we started to see the NAR's fortunes decline in Tobago. And the PNM captured the Tobago House of Assembly for the first time in 2001, when there was a 3-way contest between the PNM, the NAR, and the UNC that went in. At the time, there was a rift between Mr. Robinson and Mr. Pandey about the issue of defeated candidates being appointed as senators and as ministers. And that spilled over into the Tobago House of Assembly election with the UNC contesting. And that split vote arrangement, with the UNC splitting the votes of those who were opposed to the PNM, allowed the PNM to get control of the House of Assembly for the first time in 2001. And they've held it for 20 years until 2021, when it's now 6-6. So that it's a very interesting dynamic that's going on right now, and an attempt is being made to try to solve the problem, but I'm not so sure that the legislation that has been put forward is going to solve the problem. because the problem revolves around the presiding officer as opposed to the electoral districts.
All right, so fast forward to 2021. Here we are with the issue of the presiding officer. How does that work? Can you explain to us, and how does that affect everything else moving forward?
Right, well, when the 1996 Act was being prepared, it came after a lot of work that was being done by the Manning administration that had two technical teams, one on the central government side, one on the THA side, that were in negotiations with each other, and then a bill was being drafted to try to settle the matter. There was a change of government in November of 1995, and the UNC and AR coalition came into power. And by 1 year later, in November of 1996, there was an amendment to the Constitution, Act number 39 of 1996, and a THA Act under that amendment to the Constitution, under the authority of that amendment, Act number 40 of 1996, that basically established the new framework that we have for it. Now, one of the things that was put into that, and one of the fears that has existed in Tobago for quite some time, was that a lot of the thinking on the ground and among the political actors of the day at that time was that there was this desire not to have a president sitting in Trinidad, even though it was a president of Trinidad and Tobago, a president sitting in Trinidad deciding who the chief secretary of the Tobago House of Assembly should be. So the decision was made at that time to have the 12 elected assemblymen vote to decide who will be the chief secretary. Provision was made in the Act between Section 7 and Section 11 for a presiding officer to be elected. The presiding officer will then conduct the election for a chief secretary, and if there was an equality of votes, the presiding officer would put it again, and if there was still an equality of votes, the presiding officer would then decide who the chief secretary of Tobago will be, not the president. So the presiding officer in the situation of a tie is the kingmaker or queenmaker, as the case may be. That is why the presiding officer is so important. The issue that we're facing today is that after several attempts at 6-6, 6-6, 6-6, they cannot decide on a presiding officer because there are two nominees, one nominee from the PNM side, one nominee from the PDP side. No presiding officer is appointed. But if a presiding officer is appointed, and there is a tie for the election of a chief secretary, the presiding officer decides who the chief secretary will be. But there is no guarantee that the presiding officer will choose the party leader or who a party may want. The presiding officer may choose to keep the current chief secretary. The presiding officer may choose, if it's from the PNM side, may choose to have the leader of the Tobago Council. The presiding officer may choose the current deputy chief secretary. The presiding officer could choose anyone that the presiding officer wishes. And on the other side, the PDP side, if they got it, the presiding officer is not bound to choose the person who they have in mind, the deputy political leader of the PDP or the political leader of the PDP. It could be any one of the other PDP members. So there is no guarantee that a party caucus will get who a party caucus wants to be the chief secretary if the presiding officer has to make the call. The PNM being in power, I understand fully why they don't want to go this route, because they have no certainty that if you draw lots, that one, that they are going to win in the drawing of lots, and if they do win in the drawing of lots, they have no certainty that the person who is being nominated as presiding officer is in fact going to choose the party leader in Tobago. They may choose any one of the six. That person may choose any one of the 6 PNM members as the chief secretary, and likewise for the other side. But the PNM have more to lose than the PDP because the PNM is in power at the moment.
So there seems to be some challenge with interpreting the THA Act. It seems to be a challenge between the parties, the PDP and the PNM, what they interpret that to mean, and also the man on the ground in Tobago, they seem to also have a different view. How can you help them understand what has happened and what is to happen next?
Well, it's 12 seats, so there was always the statistical possibility that you could have 6 and 6. It has happened. The problem is not with the election of the members, because they've all been sworn in. The problem is that those sworn in members cannot now agree on a presiding officer. The presiding officer is the key to the continuation under these circumstances. So I think that what needs to be addressed is the methodology for choosing the presiding officer. What is going to be addressed is changing the number of seats to 15. But this is somewhat problematic because on the 9th of December 2020, the Elections and Boundaries Commission Tobago House of Assembly order was laid in the House of Representatives by the Prime Minister. And he laid it, the Tobago House of Assembly took the view that there was no need to change anything in Tobago, etc. They have a formula of being 25% above or 25% below in terms of the size of the electorate. The opposition, through MP Saddam Hussein, said that they too supported it, so there was unanimity on the Election and Boundaries Commission draft order. So the Tobago House of Assembly election was able to proceed because the EBC, through the draft order, made its views known, and the Prime Minister laid it on the 9th of December 2020 in the House of Representatives. So there was total unanimity that there should be 12 seats. Now it's a different story. It's that we're talking about 15, but in December, 12 seats was okay with the EBC. So I think this is where it gets a little difficult to follow, and I think that a political solution is being sought. But the Prime Minister made it clear that even if you went to 15, you could have a third party that could win one seat, and then the other two can split it, yes. 7 and 7. That's one formulation. Another one could be that, one of the persons on either side could abstain if it's 50. If it's 8 and 7 and one of them abstains on the side that has 8, you have 7-7 for the presiding officer, and you can keep on going and this one person keeps abstaining. So I think that the bill needs to have the presiding officer methodology sorted out all the way down to a tiebreaker so that this never happens again, because that is the current problem. I understand why there might be the desire to go with 15, because projecting into the other bill, there's another bill before the Parliament in a joint select committee that seeks to grant internal self-government to Tobago. That bill is proposing 15 seats. So I understand that they might be wanting to extract from that bill the notion of 15, put it into this one and sort out the 15, the business of 15. But that flies in the face of the EBC order of the 9th of December that the government and the opposition approved in the House of Representatives. Now, normally the EBC would, not less than 2 nor more than 5 years after a report again. So the EBC would really not be in line to lay another report for 2 years. So that was 2020, so not till 2022. So I don't know how long it is intended that this situation will go on, but the EBC saw no reason to make any changes in the order that was laid on December 9th, 2020. So it's an interesting political situation. I think it has been caused by the 6-6 outcome. The methodology for the presiding officer is not being fixed. That needs to be fixed. You can go at 15, 19, 17, 13, whatever you want.
Just about to
you may
ask you
still get, because Dr. Rowley is very clear when he spoke at the post-cabinet briefing some time ago, that even if you have an odd number, you could still have the same problem if one person...
So now I understand that people in Tobago are asking about the 15. Is this 15 on a whim? What's the legality surrounding this number?
Well, it appears that there were some consultations at an earlier time, public consultations, where the number 15 had been put forward, it had been agreed, it had been settled, etc. And it worked its way into the bill that is before the Parliament in the Joint Select Committee now, that is seeking to amend the Constitution to create internal self-government for Tobago. That is the only place where I can locate the 15. Now, if it is that you are going to use this current Amendment Act to the current THA Act to create 15, then if that other bill is passed that already has 15 prescribed in it, you just have to use transitional provisions to say, well, the members of the Assembly under the 15 become the members of the Assembly under the 15 for this new act. And that's what I suspect is happening. But I think that they also should attempt to deal with the issue of the presiding officer, because even if you have 15, you could still get that problem if there is a third party that wins one seat, or if there is one maverick member among a group that may have 8-7 and one of the 8 says, I'm abstaining, to create a tie. One never knows, because it means that you still will not be able to function. So I think the government needs to give some attention to having the tiebreaker for the Now, there is another view, which is that the standing orders of the House of Assembly say that where you can't settle something under their standing orders, you should have recourse to the standing orders of the House of Representatives. The standing orders of the House of Representatives in Trinidad and Tobago in the Parliament says you draw lots to determine who the Speaker should be if you can't break a tie. So they're suggesting that you should import that into the THA and use that methodology as the means for breaking the tie without recourse to changing anything in the law, just continue. So there are two views on this. One is that view, which is an existing law argument, and the other view is that the Amendment Act should try to insert a methodology to bring to finality the issue of a tie for the presiding officer. Presiding officer is very important because the presiding officer has the power to appoint a chief secretary.
Right.
That makes the presiding officer very important in this situation.
All right. So let's say government decides to go the way of addressing the matter regarding the presiding officer. What kind of process is that, and how long is that likely to take? Well,
the current bill that is there, if they add another clause that will repeat the wording of the House of Representatives standing order, suitably modified, that drawing lots would be the end result of the inability to break a tie, then you'll solve it by drawing lots. But I don't know that that may be in the political interest of the government at this time to take the chance on reducing the 100% control that they have now down to a 50% one way or the other. That's a big political risk to take, because if they lose control, then the other side controls the House, and that will change the dynamic in Tobago. But the other risk for them is an internal one within the party, because there is no guarantee that the person, if it is a PNM presiding officer who comes out of the drawing of lots, that person is going to put who the party caucus of the PNM would want in Tobago. That person could nominate any one of the members of the assembly as the chief secretary. So it could be the current chief, could be the current deputy chief, it could be the leader of the Tobago arm of the PNM, it could be any other assemblyman. So we don't know, but it's a risk. They would move from a situation where they are in control to a situation where they have to roll the dice. And that is not normally a position that many political parties would want to take that chance. Understood. To do it. Yeah.
I want to go back a little bit to the involvement of the EBC. What is that process going to be like? How involved do they need to get at this point?
Well, if there is legislation that is passed, then they would have to abide by the law. And if it is that the law is saying that there should be 15 seats, then the EBC would then have to go out and do its work. But the EBC would not normally produce another report until a minimum of 2 years has passed. Their last report was given to the Minister of Local Government in September of 2020. That report was laid in the Parliament in December of 2020 and approved unanimously. Both sides agreed to it. And then the election was held in January. So if we go back to September of 2020, the next report of the EBC on Tobago would be due by September of 2022. So if they get directions now to go with 15 seats, then they have to recalibrate. And a report will be due by September of 2022. That would mean that the current Executive Council, which is from the last THA that is a holdover, would be running the affairs of Tobago for that length of time, because you have to keep the place running, but it's on a caretaker basis. But that is a very, very long period of time for a caretaker. From January of 2021 going to sometime in December of 2022 is going to be a pretty long time for a caretaker, because the EBC would lay a report by around September of 2022, which it required not less than 2 nor more than 5 years after their last report. So the last report on Tobago was in September of 2020. That report was laid in Parliament on the 9th of December 2020 and approved, so that the President could then make an order in respect of what the Parliament approved, which is what would have happened. That clears the way for the elections to be held.
And the PDP has expressed their intention to somehow take legal action. What might that entail? What is it that you're hoping, the PDP is hoping to achieve?
Well, the PDP served a pre-action protocol letter on the clerk of the Assembly. The clerk, from what I saw in reports in the media, has responded. So I guess it's up to them now to take the next step. So the clerk has given a response to that pre-action protocol letter. So it's a situation whereby I think now it's going to be one for the PDP side to determine what they want to do, which way they want to go, because they've gotten a response.
Okay. So in the coming weeks, people in Tobago, what's in it for them? What can they expect?
Well, I think that the longer this goes on, people are going to want more than just caretaker governance. As it is now, this is the Executive Council of the former Assembly that is still in office because no new Chief Secretary has been appointed. When a new Chief Secretary is appointed, everything is vacated. Until such time as that happens, the old Executive Council stays in office. And that is raising a lot of issues in Tobago. It's keeping the caretaker arrangement in place, but then it's going to start stretching the credulity of what caretaker means, because you start getting into fresh policy initiatives and various other things. And, you know, this could have a political effect whereby the whole issue of Tobago nationalism may begin to rise up and say, look, you know, why are we being treated in this way? Let us solve our affairs. So I don't know where the politics is going to go on this, and we can't predict that, but we're dealing with a caretaker assembly, a caretaker executive council, and a newly installed assembly. Because remember, the executive council comes out of the assembly, but and that's the separation of powers, more or less. So that the president installed this new assembly cannot elect a presiding officer, so they are stalled in their business. The old executive council remains in office until a new chief secretary is appointed. A new chief secretary cannot be appointed, so the old executive council continues. And that, I think, is that dragging on, and the way in which caretaker governance is going to be explained and conducted in Tobago. The rubber is going to hit the road on this after the 30th of September 2021, when the budget runs out and there's no authority to spend money. And that is going to be the problem. But if the government passes a new budget and makes an allocation for Tobago, then this current executive council is going to continue to spend money under the new budget. And all of these are markers along the way that are going to raise issues that people are going to comment on. But I think the EBC one is the one that we have to look at. That 9th of December 2020 approval of the EBC order for Tobago. The EBC really can't come back in and make a new order until about 2 years have elapsed. So I think, you know, the EBC is one part of this, the PDP and PNM is another part of this, the clerk of the assembly is another part of this, no presiding officer is another part of this. So, you know, there are a lot of moving parts going on here. And so far, there is no instability in the sense of the inability to govern. So we'll see how this is going to play out now as we go forward. It's an interesting convergence of events.
So we are here. Tobago is at 6-6, deadlock, 6 to the PDP, 6 to the PNM. In terms of returning to the polls, do you see this affecting the electorate, the people who go out to vote? Do you think they're going to be encouraged to go out? Are we expecting a decrease in?
It's an interesting 20 years. So over a period of 40 years, we have seen the pendulum in Tobago swing one way and swing back the other way, and now swing to the center where there's a tie. And that's where it's at right now. But the voting behavior in Tobago is interesting. A.N.R. Robinson used pretty much a lot of Tobago nationalism in advocating for Tobago, that Tobago was not being fairly treated by Trinidad, and therefore cast the central government in the light of being Trinidad dominated and Trinidad centered. and did not have much care for the issues in Tobago that impacted on the lives of Tobagonians. That was a pretty successful electoral strategy. It brought great success for the DAC and then the NAR. But when Ren Robinson left the scene, there was no one who effectively filled his shoes. And in the January 2001 election, the PNM took control for the first time, until January 2021, when that control was stalled with the 6-6. So now where we go from here is going to be very interesting. Both sides, the PDP has emerged out of this long trail of DAC, NAR, passing through the Forwards and Platform for Truth and others, and ending up now at the PDP. The PNM has remained consistent as the other party. So it's really a two-party fight in Tobago. If a third party goes in, it splits the votes, and that could tilt it one way or the other depending on how this is going to play. There was a third-party intervention in 2001 when Mr. Pandey went into the UNC, and effectively that got rid of the control of the NAR in Tobago. And I don't know where this is going to go next, but it's at 6-6 right now, and we're stalled after 40 years. 20 years one way, 20 years the other way. And we see where this goes now.
Right, so before we close, Trinidad and Tobago is looking on and waiting on some finality, and of course more so Tobago. Any words for the ones looking on in hope and waiting for an end to all of this?
Well, I think that you want finality and you want something decisive. Right now, there does not appear to be any finality, and there doesn't appear to be anything decisive. It's very indecisive at the moment. But there is stability, and that is a tribute to the strength of our democracy. But we can't take that for granted. We can't keep dragging people along in this way with uncertainty. You're going to have to get some kind of certainty. Breaking the tie on the presiding officer perhaps is the easy way to resolve this, but I understand the reticence of the PNM in not wanting to do that, because they're going to go from 100% control to a 50-50 chance. And in politics, it's not that easy to do it. And then the other half of that is there's no guarantee with who the presiding officer would choose as the chief secretary. So I think the faster that they can get to a solution with regard to this, I think the better this is going to be for the people of Tobago. Going back to the polls is not going to come in short order, and that still may not be the solution to the problem. They need to also fix the presiding officer issue.
I believe by now it's supposed to come with some kind of decision to quell that, because we're not really in limbo because stuff's still going on, but yet at the same time something had to give. Not yet been resolved.
Unless the people come together, nothing will not be done. We have to have one mutual understanding, because if we love Tobago so much, we'll do what is best for Tobago. The politicians seems to...
What I'm hoping is that this thing will be resolved in a speedy time, because at the end of the day, the business of the island needs to go forward. And right now it seems like if we are on a standstill, the population does not really know what is going on, because much information is not being forwarded to us as citizens. And since as we are the persons that voted to put them there, I think it's about time that something, either they put things in place to go back to the poll, or they find some other means so that the country's business can go forward.
Thank you, Professor Ghany. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for your thoughts. Thank you for your insight. We appreciate it, and we do wish you all the best in your endeavors.
Thank you, and thank you for the interview.
And there we have it, the THA Act simplified. And all of this while Tobago remains hopeful there is an end in sight to activities as it pertains to the THA, and they're hoping that things can resume soon. So thank you for joining me, and remember to please stay safe. For TTT Limited, I am Crystal Wilson.